Welcome back to the channel. Today we don't have a build. Today we have some mechanical work to do. So this is a 2012 Dodge Journey and it's got some steering problems. So it has 77,000 miles and I guess it really doesn't have problems. It just has one problem. It doesn't want to turn right. It goes left with no problem, but it won't go right. People are so picky. They want to go in both directions. So a lot of people are quick to condemn the power steering pump, probably because that's what's making all the noise as the steering's straining. But since it's only in one direction, it's probably not the pump. That's usually both directions. What it's generally when it's one direction is the rack and pinion. Now there are a few other things we need to check before we condemn the rack and pinion, but most likely that's what it's going to be. And the fluid is pretty dirty, so that's a pretty good indication. So some of the things we need to check are worn suspension parts. A bent or worn ball joint will sometimes cause it to bind in one direction, or upper strut mounts. If the bearing inside is binding up, sometimes it'll make it harder to turn in one direction than the other. So to check that, you can just disconnect the tie rod ends and try turning the wheels. Up in the air, if it's good, you're probably okay. But it's always good to set it on the ground and put some weight on it and then try it. Both sides are the same, chances are everything's good. And then you can move on to saying it's probably definitely the rack and pinion. So some of the systems are variable and it can be sensors that are not reading correctly, but this is a pretty simple system. There's no sensors on it, it's just a pump, a rack and pinion, and some lines. Which you also want to check the lines, because if you have a line that's bent and it's restricting the power steering fluid, that could also be a problem. But spoiler alert, I've already checked all that. It's the rack and pinion. So now we're going to change it. We're actually going to change the pump too, because it's been like this for a while and it's kind of burned up the pump. Because when it's hot, it squeals like a pig.
Pull our lug nuts off. That takes our wheel cover off. Nothing says high quality automobile like plastic wheel covers. Pull this side off. Got some embedded rust in there. Looks like somebody needed a brake job and didn't do it for a while.
Want to break the jam nuts loose before we take the tie rod end off, because it's much easier than when it's on the floor and you're trying to chase it around.
Break the jam nut loose on this side. And we'll push the tie rod end down into the knuckle so that it won't spin. We can get the nut off the bottom. This is an Illinois car, so there's a little bit of rust built up in there. You could tell it was going to fight me. Do the same thing on the driver's side. I'll knock the tie rod ends loose from the knuckle. Gonna unbolt our power steering lines, run across the back, and we can break our lines loose from the rack and pinion. Surprisingly enough, they came out pretty easy and weren't rotted in there. I guess that's one positive about cars that break relatively quickly. They don't have time to rust. We'll pull the line assembly down and let it drain. Now we'll head inside the car. I'm going to pull the steering shaft off. Just pull the carpeting back and there's a little access panel down there, or hole. Pull the bolt out of the clamp. Try not to drop it down in there because I don't know where Narnia is, but that's where it's going. I'll slide the steering shaft up into the column. Set it off to the side. We did lock our steering wheel so it won't rotate and ruin the clock spring. And now we can unbolt our subframe. There's a little bracket in the back, and then there's a bolt in the center that goes through the subframe and that bracket. Then there's just one bolt in the subframe in the front. Same thing on the other side. That hole in the control arm is so you can put the extension through there to get to this bolt. That's not a coincidence. So we drop the subframe down, let it hang. That way we can get to the rack and pinion. There's a little heat shield over it that's bolted in the front, and it has some Christmas trees in the back. Get that out of the way. Now we can take our bolts out for our rack and pinion. The subframe is supported by the lower engine mount and the control arms, and it's also sitting on a stand. Pull the rack and pinion out of here. And we'll put our new one in. Start our bolts. Run our bolts down in there. Click. Now we'll put our heat shield back on. Push little Christmas trees in the back. And tighten up the 2 bolts in the front. Now we'll raise our subframe back up there. Hardest part is getting that steering shaft to go back in its boot. Once it slides up in there, job's pretty easy. That was really the only bad part. Well, that and the fact that Chrysler uses every size socket that there is, because they feel if you bought the whole socket rail, you're going to use the whole socket rail. We'll just keep raising the subframe up, making sure we don't pinch anything. And we can put our bolts in the back with a little bracket in there. We'll start the bolts, then we'll rotate the bracket and bolt it in. Put our little bolts in the bracket. Raise it up some more. Hopefully we can get those bolts in the front. We'll run them up there. And then we'll try our ones up in the front. Yep, they went in. We're in good shape. We're not going to tighten them all up just yet. We'll get them all started in case we need to shift the subframe side to side. Once we have them all started, we can run them up in there. Tighten it down to the precise amount of ugga-duggas. And it did recalibrate it for the use of the extension. So I went 1 extra ugga-dugga. So now we can put our power steering lines back in. The rack and pinion came with new O-rings for those, so we changed them out. Start the threads by hand. bolt a line to the back of the subframe, and then we'll tighten the lines up. You don't want to tighten them up first and then try and bolt them to the subframe, because if they're off a little bit, they'll have some unneeded tension on them. So you bolt them in and route them correctly, and then tighten up the fittings. Now we're going to pull our outer tie rod ends off of our old rack and pinion. Put a pair of vice grips on there and start spinning it off. It's a little rough with this Illinois rust. And I quickly decided this was probably not the easiest way. So we'll spin the jam nut off. Just use an impact to run it off of there. So for this side, we put it in the vise, and we'll spin it off with a pair of vice grips on there. A little easier. Buzz our jam nut off. It's really jammed on there. And we'll run our jam nut on there and give it a good coating of Never Sees. Couldn't find the silver stuff, so I used the copper stuff. Better than nothing. So we'll spin it on, same number of turns. Hopefully get our alignment pretty close, but probably not. It's going for an alignment anyway, so it doesn't matter. Spin our jam nut down. Then we'll tighten the tie rod end into the knuckle and jam our jam nut in there. I'll do the same thing on the passenger side. Run our jam nut in there. Hey, I found the silver stuff. Give it a good coating. Make sure it gets everywhere. Spin our tie rod end on there. Try not to get Never Sees all over the place. I don't know why I even try, because it's going to get there anyway. Tighten up our jam nut. And run the nut in the tie rod end. Now we'll climb inside, take our steering wheel holder off, so we can rotate our steering wheel a little bit, help us line it up. And then we'll tighten up the bolt in there. Now we're going to change our pump, because it's a little tired from all that work the rack and pinion was making it do. We already have our reservoir off. It's currently in the parts washer, getting a parts washer enema to remove all of what was left of the pump out of the bottom of it. So we'll pull our hose off, and we'll release our belt. We can pull our pressure line off. Now we can bolt our pressure line and slide it out of the pump. Set it off to the side. A couple bolts in the front of the pump. Spin those off of there. And we'll wiggle the pump out of there. Get our pry bar. They look like pliers, but it's really a pry bar. At least it is now. It's hard to see, but when I pulled the tension off the belt, I set the wrench back down on top of the alternator, and it kept the tensioner pulled. That way all I got to do is grab the belt, put it over the power steering pump. I don't have to worry about routing the belt around everything else, because it kept some tension on it. We'll put the fitting back in the new pump, because I guess we didn't pay for a new fitting. We had to reuse the old one. And we'll drop our pump down onto the bracket. Bolt it in. click. I'll screw our other fitting in. Guess we didn't pay for that either. Pump was actually pretty cheap. I guess I shouldn't be complaining. Torque it down. So we'll put our pressure line on there. It did come with new O-rings, so we put the new O-rings on there. Now we can put our belt back on the pulley. And wiggle our wrench out of there. Put our return line back on. Yay! Spring clamps. And the reservoir's internals are all flushed out. So we'll stick it back in. Connect our lines. Put our spring clamps back up there. Yay, spring clamps. Now we'll slide it down on its little bracket, bolt it in. Put our little cover over the engine, hide all of our problems. So what's up in the air, we just turn the wheels back and forth to push the power steering fluid through. We don't want to start that pump with it empty, because it'll burn it up real quick. So we'll work the power steering fluid through there, we'll let it sit for a little bit, all the air come to the top, we'll do it a couple times. Hopefully when we start it, it'll be nice and quiet. And turn to the right. I'll throw our wheels back on. And we're going to send it over for an alignment. You can be sure it is not even close. The moment of truth. See if this is one of those fancy cars that turns left and right. I think we still have some air in the system, so we're just going to let it sit, get the rest of those air bubbles up to the top. Hopefully it's quiet. If it is, we're done. So the repair was a success. We can turn right, there's no leaks, and there's no screaming pump. Looks like we're all done. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Oh, almost forgot. I don't want the clean freaks coming for me.